The Nuremberg Trials of 1945 and 1946 were groundbreaking in establishing accountability for crimes against humanity. The trials had serious flaws that had been widely acknowledged by historians and legal scholars. These include issues of fairness, legal consistency, and political influence. Here's a breakdown. The trials prosecuted individuals for crimes that were not clearly codified in international law at the time they were committed. Crimes against humanity and waging aggressive war were novel legal categories. This contradicted the principle that people cannot be tried for acts that were not crimes at the time they were committed. The principle of nulla poena sine lege. One other criticism brought against the Nuremberg trials was that it was selective justice, that is, the victor's justice, in the sense that only Axis leaders were tried while Allied war crimes were excluded from consideration. For example, weirdly enough, the Soviet Union sat in judgment despite its own atrocities. For example, there was the Katyn massacre or the mass deportations and the gulags that were never brought into discussion. And then there were the strategic bombing campaigns by the Allies. See the bombing of Dresden, or the Tokyo firebombing, or the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing that were not examined. This undermined the moral universality of the trials. A very dark shadow was also cast upon the judicial impartiality of the trials. The judges and the prosecutors all came from the victorious powers: the US, the UK, the USSR, and France. Defendants had no opportunity to appeal to an independent or neutral tribunal. The USSR, in particular, played a large role in shaping charges, despite having itself signed the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, which helped launch the Second World War. One other big issue with the trials was that the charges and the categories were inconsistent. The concept of conspiracy to commit aggressive war was vague and stretched beyond standard legal definitions. Some defendants were convicted for belonging to organizations such as the SS or the Gestapo, making guilt by association a legal precedent. Sentencing varied greatly even for similar actions, raising questions of consistency. Another thing that stood out were the egregious procedural issues. The defense lawyers had limited access to evidence. Many prosecution documents were accepted without cross examination, especially the Soviet evidence, sometimes forged, such as the attempts to blame the Katyn massacre on the Germans. Hearsay evidence was often allowed. The trials sometimes blurred the line between legal process and political theater. Then there was the propaganda value of the trials. While legally groundbreaking, the trials also functioned as a stage for the Allies to present a moral narrative of World War II. This dual purpose, justice versus propaganda, compromised their perceived objectivity. Last but not least, there were the legacy issues of the trials. The flaws of Nuremberg made later tribunals, for example that for Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, more cautious with stronger procedural safeguards and attempts at impartiality. Critics argue that Nuremberg set a precedent for selective enforcement of international law. Powerful nations judge weaker ones but remain immune themselves. In summary, we can say that the Nuremberg trials were historic and necessary in holding the Nazi leadership accountable, but they were flawed by ex post facto laws, selective justice, lack of impartiality, procedural shortcomings, and political influence. They were a mix of genuine justice and victor's justice, a contradiction that continues to complicate their legacy. So, what do you think? Did the Nuremberg Tribunal impart victors justice? I'd love to hear your take on the topic, so go ahead and drop me a line or two in the comments section. Hope to see you in the next episode.